Mondays have never been my favorite, and this one turned out to be particularly tough. My wife, Peggy, seemed really down and distant. She went through the motions of making breakfast for me and our boys, Robert and Dave, but it was like she was on autopilot. She wasn't being mean, just seemed really sad. This didn't exactly set a cheerful tone for the morning. I didn't know what was bothering her, and honestly, I wasn't in the mood to ask. After seeing off my sons to school, I headed to work. I've been working at a freight company for the past 15 years, dealing with loading and unloading container ships. It's demanding work, but the pay is good. My dream has always been to sail around the world, exploring different places and meeting new people. However, the reality was that my responsibilities at home took precedence. Despite the occasional bouts of sadness over my unfulfilled dream, I cherished my family life. I had 2 wonderful sons and a loving wife. But, of course, it was Monday. One of the downsides of my job was dealing with some people I really disliked. Colin Farrell, the most obnoxious guy I've ever known, and his 3 buddies, Bob Timbers, Ray Collins, and Freddy Springer. We all went to high school together, and my feelings towards them hadn't changed. Today, Colin decided to stir up trouble early in the day, commenting on my absence from the party on Saturday night. Just to give you some context, there was a company party on Saturday, but my boys and I had to go to Chester to help my father move out of his house. My mother passed away 6 months ago, and Dad decided to downsize. Peggy was disappointed about missing the party, so I encouraged her to go without us. When we returned on Sunday night, I asked her how the party went, and she simply replied with an okay. I just stared at Colin without uttering a word. He apologized for my absence at the party, but thanked me for letting my wife attend, claiming she made the whole evening enjoyable. His friends laughed like a group of hyenas, seeming to share a private joke at my expense. Feeling my anger rise, I clenched my fists as I walked away, but Colin followed, continuing his taunts. He remarked on how lucky I was to have my wife, saying she had developed into a fine woman since high school. It was clear that this day was going to be challenging. My frustration intensified, veins bulging on my forehead, and the tendons in my neck tightening. Throughout my life, controlling my temper had been a constant struggle. Despite my efforts to walk away, Colin persisted. As I turned to face them, he tossed something red toward me. It turned out to be a pair of panties, claiming Peggy had forgotten them on Saturday and might need them to match the red bra she wore. The group burst into laughter, but I stood there, refusing to pick up the red silk from the loading platform. I realized I had stopped breathing, feeling the tension in my stomach muscles. I was like a coiled spring, ready to unleash my fury. I could handle any one of them individually, but facing them all at once might be a challenge, and frankly, I didn't care at that moment. As I moved towards them, ready to confront my tormentors, a large hand grabbed my shoulder. It was Josh Hamilton, the dock foreman. He looked me in the eye and nodded toward the main office without saying a word. Glaring at the group with a level of hatred they hadn't seen before, I followed Josh up the stairs. Oddly, their laughter ceased, and worried expressions replaced their earlier amusement. Josh entered Henry Clark's office, and I took a seat across from Henry's secretary, Sally. "No thanks. I don't want coffee right now. I'm too upset to even hold a cup," I replied to Sally's offer. Looking through the glass partition, I could see Josh and Henry having a serious conversation. Something was up. Turning to Sally, I asked if she had been at the party on Saturday night. She nodded yes, desperate for answers. I wanted to know what had happened because Peggy hadn't said anything, and I felt lost. Sally hesitated, telling me it's something I should discuss with my wife. I insisted. "You were there, Sally. You saw what happened. Just give me a clue." Sally, clearly trying to avoid the conversation, shuffled papers on her desk. I pleaded with her, saying I needed to know. Reluctantly, she began to share what she knew. Peggy showed up at the party looking stunning, and after about an hour, Colin started giving her drinks. Peggy seemed to enjoy herself, but Colin and his friends kept whispering and laughing whenever he refilled their drinks. Eventually, Peggy and Colin went to the storeroom in the back. Later, Bob, Ray, and Freddy joined them, disappearing for about an hour. When they all returned, Peggy was smiling but looked disheveled. Her hair and dress were a mess. Peggy and Colin left together about 10 minutes later. I thanked Sally, even though I didn't want to hear the details. It explained a lot. We sat in silence for about 10 more minutes. Josh came out and gestured for me to go in. He expressed his dissatisfaction with what happened that morning and informed me that Colin, Ray, Bob, and Freddy each got a week off with no pay. Josh informed me about what happened on Saturday, and I guess it's the first time you're hearing about it. He suggested I take a 2-week vacation. Henry, my boss, told me this isn't my fault, but he can't risk having anyone in the hospital. He expects me to sort things out before coming back. Henry assured me he'd help however he could, and told me to ask for anything. With that, he told me to leave. I thanked Henry and thanked Sally again as I exited the office. Surprisingly, Colin and his buddies were nowhere to be found as I headed to the parking area. I left the panties on the dock. Instead of going home, I drove north, searching for a place where I could find solace. During the long drive, my mind dwelled on the past and the present. Peggy and I attended high school together. Back then, she wasn't considered attractive. Big, fat, sloppy, and not great at grooming or makeup. Her hair was always a mess, and socially, she wasn't part of the in crowd. She was more of a social outcast. Strangely, that's what drew me to her. At 6'3" and close to 300 pounds, I was large but clumsy, shy, and not considered attractive. Sports weren't my thing due to my awkwardness. Colin Farrell, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. Good-looking, smooth-talking, and athletic. It might sound silly, but the rumor was that girls wanted Colin to take them out to be their first. He never had a steady girlfriend but always had a date. I despised him. He'd brag about his conquests, and most girls didn't seem to mind except Peggy. Peggy had tried to get Colin to take her out because she wanted to say he was her first. Colin not only rejected Peggy but also spread the news to the whole school. He claimed he only wanted to be with certain girls and wouldn't even consider being with someone like Peggy. The other kids thought it was funny, but it really hurt Peggy. I saw this as my chance to step in. Not knowing much about dating, I simply started being friendly. Soon, we became close, and by the time we finished school, we were a couple. I was the one who got to be her first. After school, I got a job as a construction laborer. In just a year, I transformed from flabby to all muscle and sinew. I became strong and coordinated, no longer a walking joke. Peggy and I got married within a year. Our 2 sons, Robert and Dave, were born close together. Peggy started going to a neighborhood gym, and the change was incredible. Along the way, she learned how to style her hair, put on just the right amount of makeup, and dress beautifully. She looked amazing, and I was proud to call her my wife. I loved her when she wasn't considered attractive, and my reward was seeing her transform into a princess. When I got the job at the loading dock, our whole life took a positive turn until today. Driving on the A14, which turned into the A1, I kept thinking about where I was going, knowing it was just a matter of time. My thoughts turned to my 2 sons. They came from strong stock and showed it. We made sure they were active so they wouldn't become like we used to be. Dave was a bit taller and leaner than Robert, who had large hands and arms. Both were fit and able to take care of themselves. We taught them the importance of restraint and not being bullies. Their shared goal was to go to sea, and I promised to support them in whatever they wanted to do. Peggy was an excellent mom and a wonderful wife. She managed our home well and didn't spend money on unnecessary things. I believed we had a great sex life. It was fun, and I was satisfied with that part of our relationship. As I continued driving on the M6, the shadows grew longer, and I hoped to reach Port Patrick before it got dark. The trip took 7 hours, but it was the only place I wanted to be at that moment. When I spotted the A75, I knew I was on the right track, just as the sun was setting. There were plenty of parking spaces near the Duke Stock this time of year. I handed my keys to the bartender and asked for a room for the week. I didn't have any luggage, a change of clothes, or a razor, but I didn't care. He handed me the room key, and my car keys went on the same hook. I grabbed a pint and sat in the back corner, the street light shining through the amber bottle glass window by my head. It was time to numb myself and forget about the world. I'd wake up in my room late in the mornings, vaguely recalling how I got there. Usually one of the local regulars would help me up the stairs and drop me on the bed, although I never managed to get under the sheets. I splashed some water on my face and sometimes took a shower, even though putting on the same clothes afterward didn't do much for my smell. A fierce-looking beard had grown on my face, something I had never let happen before. Every few days they processed my credit card to keep the tab up to date. I had been wallowing in self-pity for quite a while, and I was starting to get tired of it. Sitting there with glassy eyes, Staring at the dartboard for the 1,000th time, 2 police officers walked in. I watched them without really looking at them. After talking to the bartender, he nodded in my direction and pointed to my keys on the wall. I figured they were looking for me. I was pretty impressed with myself. The officers didn't bother talking to me. Instead, they just kept giving me coffee for the next 2 hours. They asked if I, Grady Baxter, could talk to them. I wondered if I did something wrong. They said they just needed to chat, and asked if I was up for it. I suggested going outside, and even though the sun was shining, everything was wet. The street's cobbles were slippery, and since I still felt a bit tipsy, I took my time walking across to the seawall. The whole street was sloped, and the cool air felt great as I breathed it in. I don't smoke, but the air inside was so thick it felt similar. Leaning over the granite seawall, I threw up. It was mostly liquid because I hadn't eaten much solid food the past few days. My head and eyes started to clear as I got myself together. My 2 companions waited patiently. I felt a bit guilty for causing them so much trouble. The bench I sat on was wet, but I didn't mind. I asked them what I could help them with. They explained they were trying to find me since I had been missing for 10 days. Additionally, they were looking for Colin Farrell and hoped I could help. I assured them they found me, and I hadn't seen Colin since I arrived here. The barkeep had probably told them I hadn't left the inn since checking in. I had no idea where Colin was, but I thought I might look for him when I got home. We chatted for about another hour. They had nothing to charge me with, and after confirming I was safe, their main interest seemed to be talking about Colin. They found me through my credit card charges. I made a mental note not to make that mistake again if it ever came up. I went down the hill, bought some fresh clothes and a toothbrush, and decided to keep the beard, even though it looked bad. After a final shower, I paid my bill and started my journey home. I stopped about 4 times on the way, grabbing something to eat twice, but mostly trying to delay my arrival. Coming home, I knew there wasn't anything pleasant or enjoyable waiting for me, but I did want to see my boys. She, Peggy, was sitting on the couch. Only one light was on in the living room. She watched me with her hands on her lap, afraid to move. It seemed like she had been crying, but it was hard to be sure in the dim light. I thought about getting a beer, but the idea made me a little nauseous, so I grabbed a Coke instead. Sitting in the recliner across from her, I waited for her to say something. She told me the boys were staying with friends for the night, and it was her idea for some private time to talk. I asked her why she didn't tell me about it before I found out. She said she was scared and wasn't sure how I would react. She admitted to doing something stupid that backfired on her. When I asked what backfired, she hesitated, asking if I would get mad at her. I told her I didn't know, and that it would probably be better if she told the truth. Peggy then reminded me of what Colin did to her in high school. She revealed that on Saturday night at the party, she set a trap for him as a way to get even. I interrupted, saying it didn't sound like the story I heard. She asked me to listen and explained that dressing up and letting Colin think he was succeeding was part of her plan. They went to the storeroom, kissed a bit, and he started playing with her without going past her bra. She slipped off her panties and waved them under his nose to tempt him. I was upset, asking her why she did it and what she was thinking. She confessed she wanted to get even with him and make him pay for humiliating her. Despite my frustration, she continued, saying she noticed a bulge in his pants, so she told him to take them off to enjoy themselves. He dropped his pants and underwear, and then I did something girls aren't supposed to do. When you asked what I did, I pointed at his private part and started laughing. I told him it was a pathetic excuse for that body part, and I wasn't going to let someone with a tiny one like that be with me. As I made fun of him, it started to shrink until there was nothing left but a limp thingy. It was a mean thing to do, but I thought it was fitting in this case. I gathered myself and opened the door to leave. Bob, Ray, and Freddy were waiting outside. Colin had told them they could go next after he was done with me, and they were waiting their turns. I walked past them, went to the ladies' room laughing, and when I came back to the party, they were all standing around with big smiles on their faces. Apparently, they told everyone at the party that they had been with me in the storeroom to get back at me for embarrassing Colin. Someone told me you left with Colin. That's not true. I left by myself and drove straight home. They said you left your panties there for Colin. No. I just forgot them when I left. Why didn't you tell me? After they twisted everything around, I got scared. I didn't know what to say to you. So, I let you find out for yourself in front of my workmates. I felt foolish, like I'd been made a fool of. They teased me about what happened. And I couldn't even respond because I didn't know the full story. I had to find out from a secretary, and her version doesn't exactly match yours. She wasn't there, but I was. What I told you is what happened. Darn it, Grady. I am your wife. You were supposed to stick up for me and support me. Peggy started to cry and walked into the kitchen. I sat there with my Coke, watching as Peggy leaned on the table, softly crying. I loved her a lot. She was the only girl I ever cared about. However, I felt like she was feeding me untrue stories and putting on a show. Peggy wanted to save our marriage, but Sally, who had no reason to lie, had a different story. I thought about questioning Peggy on the inconsistencies in her story, but I decided against it. I couldn't change what happened, and forcing Peggy to admit something she didn't want to wouldn't help. I did want to know the truth, but it seemed I wouldn't get it from her. So, I decided to leave things as they were and let her relax. I took another shower and got into bed with my wife. She laid her head on my shoulder, whispered that she loved me, and we both fell asleep. I still had a few days off before going back to work. The boys were glad to see me, but they kept a bit of distance. I suggested a drive to London, and Peggy seemed happy that the men in her family were bonding. During the drive, I learned the boys were both suspended for fighting, which wasn't allowed in our family. They explained they were getting a lot of trouble about their mother's party incident, and decided to put an end to it. Some boys with smart mouths ended up with loose teeth and black eyes. They kept the suspension from their mother, but asked me about the party. I postponed the conversation. We went to the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, got 3 applications, and filled out all the forms. After interviews and getting medical forms, we went to Wagamama for supper and started heading home. We agreed not to mention anything to their mother or friends. The physicals were done the next day, and now all we had to do was wait. I always loved Peggy. She was the only girl I ever loved, kissed, and had sex with. It was hard for me to believe she could do something so low. I found her actions despicable and unforgivable. Despite that, I was still willing to give her a chance if somehow her story could be proven, though the chances seemed slim. However, at the end of that week, she added the final blow. Peggy had been careful not to mention anything about the party or my trip to Port Patrick. She was trying hard to resume our life as it was. The next day at breakfast, she dropped a bombshell. She said, "Grady, I was thinking, I would like to have another baby." Now, I understood what the love session the night before was all about. To understand the stupidity of this comment, we need some background. Peggy had been on birth control pills for years after the boys were born. About 3 years ago, she stopped taking them due to side effects. We weren't using any other birth control. A short time later, I got a procedure done to ensure I couldn't have more children. I never told Peggy about it. For the last 3 years, we had unprotected sex with no pills, no condoms, and no diaphragm. During all this time, Peggy never wondered why she wasn't getting pregnant. Now, suddenly, she wanted to have a baby. Either she's extremely stupid, or she thinks I am. I looked at her in amazement and said, "I think that would be great, honey." As a man, I don't know much about pregnancy, but since almost 3 weeks had passed since the party, there's a good chance Peggy had missed a period and was trying to cover up. This changed everything, so I decided to speed up my plans. The boys were back in school, and I talked to them before they left. They seemed to understand my situation with their mother better than I did. Having their support made me feel better, no matter what happened. I wasn't sure what would happen next. Most of the day, I looked for Colin Farrell. He had to be somewhere. During lunch, I went to the docks and spoke to Sally. Bob, Ray, and Freddy were back at work, but she didn't know what was happening with Colin. The rumor was he was afraid I would go after him, but that didn't make sense since I was a peaceful person. I avoided the work area to stay away from my 3 tormentors. That afternoon, I visited a local lawyer and began the paperwork to divorce Peggy. I didn't want to hurt her, but I didn't want to live with her anymore. The boys would be on their own soon, and I didn't see any reason for me to stay. The one problem I couldn't shake was the need to thank Colin and his boys for ruining my marriage. I knew the main fault was Peggy's, but I couldn't punish her. Her partners would have to face consequences for their poor choices. Freddie Springer was married, but always stopped by McMurray's for a pint before heading home. Just after dark, he came out the side door, walking to his car in the rear. I surprised him when I grabbed his left arm, twisted it up behind his back and ran him into the wall. I heard a few things break as his face met the brick. I held him by his arm, pounding his kidneys with my right fist. As he sank lower, my fist hit higher, and I could hear ribs cracking. After about 20 hits, his arm went loose, and I dropped into the cobblestones. A group of people came down the alley, but no one chased me as I calmly walked to my car and drove away. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the police station. Peggy had just put the house up for collateral to get bail and was finishing the paperwork. Alice Springer came storming and screaming, demanding that I be put away forever. They managed to keep her away from me, but she didn't stop until Peggy talked to her. I'm not sure what Peggy said, but Alice looked at both of us like we were dirt and walked out. Robert and Dave had my car and drove me home while Peggy followed. The boys seemed proud of me, but I was careful not to say or do anything to encourage them. Freddy had a dislocated shoulder, a broken nose, 2 black eyes, and many internal injuries that they hadn't fully identified yet. 4 ribs were broken, but thankfully, none had punctured his lungs. When we got home, my wife and I didn't speak about the problem. I slept on the couch for the first time in 20 years, but I didn't mind. Early the next morning I was up and out, trying to figure out what to do next. The Osakamaru was unloading at Felix still. The captain, Jose Costa, was agreeable, and willing to take me on when and if I got my papers. I promised to get back to him later in the week. On the way home, I stopped to top off the gas tank. Just as I finished, I noticed someone rushing toward me. I turned just as Ray Collins hit me on the left side with a piece of 2x4. It glanced off my left arm before cracking a couple of ribs. I squinted my eyes and bent over from the pain, trying to breathe but unable to inhale. With my eyes closed, I saw bright white flashes and then felt my knees buckle. The wooden club made a funny clunking noise as it bounced around on the asphalt. Ray wasn't able to hold on to it after the impact. My right hand darted out as I was falling and grabbed some flannel. I twisted around to the left as I rammed my right fist with flannel into the ground. I felt myself land on Ray's body. Hard. My eyes were still clenched shut, trying to block out the pain in my left side. I couldn't move my left arm. I was acting on instinct as my right hand started to hammer up and down. I don't know what I was hitting, but as long as it was asphalt, it was good. Both sides of my body were working independently. As my left side crunched up for protection, my right side was attacking anything it could find. Ray, who initially squirmed under me, trying to get free, eventually became still after a few seconds. I didn't stop hitting him until some customers pulled me off. Still struggling to breathe properly, one of the medics gave me a shot, and I slept all the way to the hospital. When I woke up a few hours later, I had a sling on my left arm, and my body was taped tight. Breathing was possible, but I had to be careful. Peggy was there, looking displeased. Peggy asked, "What do you think you were doing, Grady? You made a fuss over that little party problem." I apologized, saying I didn't do anything. I asked why her friend attacked me with a 2x4 and demanded a better explanation about what happened that Saturday. Peggy seemed defensive, and I insisted on knowing the truth, threatening to talk to others if she didn't explain. I denied being a bully and emphasized not calling them my boyfriends. Peggy left just as the doctor entered. The doctor mentioned that I was more bruised than broken. Ray's swing was like that of a little boy, and my arm was just sore. The cracks in my ribs were superficial, causing pain and breathing problems due to the impact. The next morning, Robert and Dave picked me up, grinning from ear to ear. I told them to stop and shared that Ray was in bad shape, needing a month to eat through a straw and a week for the swelling on his face to go down. An errant blow did break his left collarbone. No charges were filed against me because witnesses testified that Ray attacked first. I had to call into work and get another week off. I had to take another sick leave from work. Sally informed me that Bob Timbers had quit, and his final paycheck was being sent to his brother's house in Aberdeen. Colin's whereabouts were still unknown. Peggy and I weren't communicating well. I found myself sleeping on the couch every night. Though I quickly got rid of the arm sling, my ribs were still a bit sore, but at least I could move and breathe normally. The Osaka Maru was set to leave in 4 days. I visited my lawyer, and since the divorce papers were ready, I instructed him to have them served in 4 days. I left everything with Peggy, including the house, which the bonding company would take when I skipped bail. I didn't mind. I included a copy of the vasectomy paperwork and a recent sperm count lab report with the divorce papers. I made calls to friends in Scotland and spent time at the gym, trying to recover from the 2x4 attack. Henry Clark wasn't pleased with my departure, but he agreed to keep it quiet for as long as possible. I asked him to look out for my boys if needed. Peggy had stopped going to the gym, and the house was falling into disarray. The wash was backing up, and the overall appearance of the place was deteriorating. Meals were hastily put together, and the conversations were less than lively. It seemed like she was putting on weight again. Everything went downhill in just 4 weeks. The following day, my boys handed me my set of maritime papers, looking happier than ever. All 3 of us were ready to go, but I advised them to finish the school year before making any decisions. I don't think they were really listening. What? I returned to the Osaka Maru, took care of necessary arrangements, received a list of items to get before sailing the next morning, and checked into my room on board. Then, I left the ship one last time. Robert had parked his Triumph, Bonneville 750, at the end of the dock. A few minutes later, I set off for Aberdeen. Riding a motorcycle for 8 hours isn't enjoyable. The Triumph shook so much that the odometer couldn't be read. The engine ran smoothly, and the weather held up, but I was relieved when I finally arrived. My friends had found Bob Timbers and planned to bring him to the Four Crowns. The men's room was at the back of the place, and you had to exit the building to get to it. I stopped in briefly, just enough to let my buddies know I had arrived. Then I went to the side of the building and waited. The first 2 guys were locals, but soon Bob came out. I heard the door lock behind him as he headed towards the toilet. I grabbed his right arm, similar to what I did with Freddy, and pressed his head against the stone wall as we went down the alleyway. His face scraped along the stone as he stumbled. After about 50 feet, I dropped him against the wall. He was moaning and crying in pain. In the dim light from the street lamp, I could see his right eye socket filled with blood, his cheekbone exposed below his eye, and the entire side of his face covered in abrasions. "Don't kill me, Grady. Please, don't kill me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." I had no intention of killing him, but I figured there was no point in telling him that. "I'll give you a choice, Bob. Tell me the truth about everything that happened at the party, and I'll let you live. Lie to me, and you die." Okay. I'm hurting, Grady, and I'll get you a doctor." When Peggy came into the party without you, Colin got all excited. He started boasting about how he planned to get Peggy drunk and have sex with her. Honestly, Grady, she did look good. She was all dressed up and seemed ready to have a good time. Colin began giving her lots of drinks and said we could have our turn later. We didn't believe he could actually make it happen. After a while, he took her to the storeroom, and we followed. "Do you really want to hear this, Grady?" "Yes. Keep going." "Okay, but don't hurt me anymore." Behind the door, we could hear Colin and Peggy getting intimate. She was moaning and saying explicit things like the girls in adult movies. Just listening got us really excited. Eventually, Colin opened the door. Peggy was on the couch with one knee up, exposing herself. Her top was down, her breasts were out, and she had a big smile on her face. Each of us took turns, and she also engaged in oral activities while being intimate. Grady, we never hurt her. We never forced her to do anything she didn't want to do. Colin and Freddy did things differently, but Ray and I weren't into that. Afterward, we helped her get dressed. She and Colin left together, and I think they stopped somewhere before he dropped her off, but I'm not sure. That's it, Grady. I'm sorry. We didn't hurt her. Honestly. And we didn't make her do anything she didn't want to do. I just looked at him. "Do you know where Colin Farrell is?" He shook his head no, don't. This man was in no position to lie to me. His story was a lot closer to the one Sally told me than to the one Peggy told me. His face looked terrible in the yellow light. He was bleeding more, and his eye socket was turning a dull black color. His cheek had flakes of skin hanging, and the exposed raw flesh underneath was bright red. After knocking on the locked pub door, greeting a couple of old friends, I hopped on the bike. A few miles down the road, I saw the medical emergency vehicle heading to the pub. Early in the morning, I parked the Triumph where I got it and boarded the Osaka Maru. Robert would pick up the bike later. My first duty was scheduled for that night, so I spent the rest of the day recovering from the challenging motorcycle trip. I should have taken the car. After a few hours of sleep, I showered and had some supper. My supervisor gave me a job description, explained my duties, and left me alone. The entry-level job wasn't too difficult. However, my crewmates were unfriendly and not very helpful. They answered direct questions but offered no assistance or advice. None of them seemed interested in forming any kind of connection. While I hoped for camaraderie, it seemed challenging. I decided to be patient. Peggy was now aware that I was gone, probably having received her divorce papers that morning. Bob Timbers likely shared his story with the authorities. I could imagine my two mischievous sons snickering over the unfolding events. After my shift, I went to bed. 2 days later, I was summoned to the captain's office in the middle of the day. Captain Costa didn't seem pleased as I stood in front of him. "Mr. Baxter, the Royal Navy has requested permission to land a helicopter on the Osaka Maru to transport you back to the mainland. I received an extensive wire this morning justifying the request. I will summarize some of the items on the extradition request. If there are any errors, you can explain them." I simply nodded in agreement. They wanted to talk to me about the disappearance of a man named Colin Farrell. "You're facing charges for beating a man named Fred Springer so severely that he lost one kidney and might lose the other. You forfeited bail on that charge. There are also charges against you for hurting a guy named Ray Collins, initially listed as self-defense, but now changing due to severity. Finally, on the night you boarded the ship, you beat a man named Bob Timber in Aberdeen so badly that he lost his right eye. I don't know how you could be here in Aberdeen at the same time, and I don't want to know. It says here that all this chaos was done with your bare hands to avenge a personal affront. Any comments, Mr. Baxter?" "Sir, I apologize for any problems I might have caused you. Regarding the charges, if I could have found Colin Farrell, he would be in the hospital with the other 3. I genuinely don't know where that person is. I'll pack my things and get ready for the helicopter when it arrives." Captain Costa just looked at me and smiled. "That won't be necessary." I told them you never got aboard. There is no Grady Baxter on the Osaka Maru. Now get back to work." I went back to the crew quarters, took a shower, and got ready for my shift. By the time I finished the evening meal, the police report had circulated through the entire crew. For the rest of the tour, I had more friends than I could handle. I had no contact with anyone from home until we were about a month out. I got a wire from my lawyer. The divorce had already been finalized, so I was now a free man. Peggy lost the house to the bail bond company when I left the country. Colin Farrell was in the hospital with extensive internal injuries and 2 broken kneecaps. The police were looking for Robert and Dave in connection with the beating. My sons found Colin with Peggy in our bedroom before the house was taken back. Peggy was now living in Austell with her sister. She was pregnant, and her old weight problem was creeping back. I still had charges pending, and my attorney recommended that I do not return. He didn't know where my sons were. This news left me with mixed emotions. The following day at breakfast, the captain walked past our table and stopped. "I just wanted to let you know that Robert and Dave Baxter are not aboard the Tanakamara headed for Cape Town." We both smiled. I always wanted to be a seafaring man. Dear listener, if you've made it this far, please click on the subscribe button. It would be a great help.